Yeah. Greetings once more to our students. I want us to continue making our tutorials. You are talking with Butomi Bila here, your chairperson of education. I just want us to continue with what we do best. Today we'll be talking about the teaching criteria. The teaching criteria for our University of Venda Philosophy of Education, PHE 2521. Teaching criterion. When we talk about teaching criterion, we have to note the word criteria. Criteria is plural, then criterion is singular. So what does the word criteria mean? Criteria means the standard which we use to choose, or these are the characteristics which we consider when we judge something. It's like when we say someone is good in dancing. What are the criteria which we use to judge that? Criteria is the standards. Like if we say someone is so good in dancing, what are the things which we have to look at in order for us to make that conclusion? It means we're going to check the steps, how much they jump, how much they turn their waist. So those things which we'll use to judge, they are called criteria. So a criteria is a standard or characteristic of measurement. So when we are talking about teaching criteria, we are talking about the things which we have to check if teaching is really taking place. Without these characteristics, these standards, it means teaching is not taking place. That's why we call them teaching criteria. Under teaching criteria, we've got three things which we need to check. As I've explained, that a criteria means a characteristic or a standard of measure. It's something which you use to measure something, to evaluate. It's a criteria. So when we talk about teaching criteria, we have to look three things, which is the intentionality criterion. Intentionality criterion talks about the subject matter. It talks about what the teacher is teaching. Intentionality criteria. We also talk about the reasonableness criteria, which is the teacher who is teaching the subject matter. Then the third thing is the criteria of reasonableness and manner. The criterion of manner or rationality. Those are the things which we check when we are judging teaching. Three things: intentionality criterion, which is the subject matter; reasonableness criterion, which is the teacher; then manner or rationality. Okay, we will start by explaining intentionality criterion. Intentionality criterion, which is the subject matter. It's like the things which we are teaching. If we are teaching a life science on intentionality criterion, it means we're going to be talking about a life science. So what can we say about intentionality criterion, which is the subject matter, the subject? First thing, teaching should bring about learning. It means when you are teaching a subject, you must induce learning. As you are teaching, you must make sure that learning is taking place. What do we mean that Teaching should bring about learning. In other words, we mean as you teach, it must be not the fact that you are just teaching. As you are teaching, the people whom you are teaching, they must be learning something. For example, as you teach, they must be gaining information. They must be gaining knowledge, so that the things which you teach, it is able to help them on their everyday life. So when we say teaching must bring about learning, it means what you teach must bring a change to the people whom you are teaching. It is possible for someone to teach you something, but whatever you are being taught, it is not bringing about learning. It is, let's say I'm teaching you maths, you are not understanding anything. It does not mean I'm not teaching, right? I'm teaching. But that teaching, because you are not understanding, it is not bringing about learning. So that's the first point. Teaching must bring about learning. The second thing, teaching must bring awareness among learners. It means, as we are still under intentionality criterion, which is the subject, it means the subject which you teach must bring awareness, must make learners to be aware. For example, as a teacher, when you are teaching, let's say you are teaching about HIV and AIDS, or you are teaching about reproduction, it's a biology class. It means as a teacher, you need to make the learners aware. Your subject matter need to make your learners aware that, for example, if I have unprotected sex, I might contract STIs, or I can get pregnant. It means as you are teaching, after, the learners will become aware that if I have unprotected sex, I might get pregnant. It means your teaching has bring about awareness. Remember, we're still on intentionality criterion, which is the subject matter. It means your subject must bring about awareness. It must make the learners to be aware. The third thing is the subject matter must produce, or it must bring something. It must bring something out. It must produce. As you are teaching the subject, we must be able to see that what you were teaching have produced something. What do I mean by that? For example, you can go to school, you go to university, you become educated. Then you don't produce anything. You just continue with what some other people have been doing. But there is someone who can go to school, go to university. Then after some years, you find that they've created an app to assist students to teach mathematics. You see, they've produced something. You find someone, they have produced a cell phone with another new technology. You can charge a phone for 20 minutes and it is full, battery full. So you see, the subject matter, which is the intentionality criterion, it must produce something. A teacher, when you teach, you must teach learners to be able to produce something, to come out with something, to bring a solution where they live. They come up with thoughts, not only bringing something which is technological, as I gave an example. You must be able to produce when there's no solution in your hometown, in your village. You are able to come up with something. You produce something better, which is going to assist the community. The fourth thing is that teaching must bring, teaching rather the subject matter. It must make learners to be creative. It must make learners to be creative. Remember, we're still under the intentionality criterion. Intentionality criterion, which talks about subject matter, or the subject which you are teaching. That subject must make learners to be creative. It means the learners that are able to think in a creative manner. they are able to manipulate things to bring about something which is more better than the previous one. They are creative, these people. They are able to think, they are able to come up with ideas. It means your subject matter, the intentionality criterion, it must make learners to be creative. Another thing, the subject matter, it must make learners to be aware of various possibilities. They must be aware of various possibilities. In other words, your subject matter, the intentionality criterion, a teacher must make sure the subject, it makes learners to be open-minded, to know that the way to go to do something is not only this way. We can find other ways to do it. So your subject matter must not harness the mind of the learners, like making them to focus in one direction, sort of to cram, to only think the only way to do something is what they were taught in class. You need to make them know there are various possibilities, there are various ways to do something. You need to make learners know that you must not harness their mind in your subject matter. So we can add many more. We can talk of a teacher can avoid to be unrealistic in their subject matter. The subject matter must not be unrealistic. It must be reasonable, the subject matter, as I've explained that under intentionality criterion we're talking about the subject matter. So the subject matter must not be unrealistic. Okay, we're coming to the criterion number 2. Criterion number 2, which is reasonableness criterion. Reasonableness criterion. Reasonableness criterion, it talks about the teacher. Remember I said we've got 3 criterion. The intentionality criterion, which talks about the subject matter, or the subject must bring about learning. Now I want to talk about reasonableness criterion, which talks about the teacher. The teacher, it means we're going to talk about the teaching methods, the teaching skills, the way a teacher presents themselves to learners under reasonableness criterion. So the first thing about the teacher first is teaching should be relevant. When you are teaching the learners as a teacher, you need to be relevant. You must talk about things which are relevant to the learner. As a teacher, you cannot be able to teach about the happenings which are happening in China instead of teaching about what is happening in South Africa. You must teach things which are relevant to the life of learners, to their everyday life, things which they know, things which they are surrounded of. So teachers should be relevant. We are on reasonableness criterion, which is the teacher. So teaching should be relevant. The second thing, the method of teachers should give a room for learners to interact with them. It means the method which the teacher uses must give a room for learners to interact with them. Meaning a teacher must not come to class and make everything to be about them, to come to class and allow themselves to talk alone. They come out of the class afterward. It means a teacher, when they teach, their method of teaching must have a room for learners to interact with them. The second thing is the method of teaching should determine the intended learning objectives. It means, as a teacher, before you start teaching, you need to tell learners the learning objectives, what you are trying to achieve by your lesson. You need to outline those things, that at the end of this lesson, you must be able to define this concept, you must be able to explain it, and you must be able to describe it. It means, as a teacher, under reasonable criteria, which is the teacher, you must be able to show the intended objectives for your lesson, which is very important. Every lesson must begin by the lesson objectives. The fourth thing, we can talk about your teaching must bring results. As a teacher, we need to see good results. If you have been teaching, we expect learners to pass. We expect learners to do well. We need to see the good results. The fifth thing we can talk about, the teacher's method should be reasonable. The method which you use to teach, it should be reasonable. There are some lessons which need you to use the lecture method. There are some lessons which need you to use the discussion method. So as a teacher, you need to determine a reasonable teaching method to use. Another thing is the teacher must be flexible. A teacher must be flexible and must demonstrate what they teach. A teacher must be flexible and demonstrate what they teach. As a teacher, you must be flexible. Learners must not be afraid of you. They must be able to feel welcome, to want to interact with you. So I think we can say I've explained enough points about reasonableness criterion, which is the teacher. We're going to the third criterion. We've already talked about two. Teacher's criterion. The first one we said is the intentionality criterion, which talks about the subject matter. It is talking about what you are teaching, meaning what you are teaching must bring awareness. What you are teaching must produce something. What you are teaching must make learners to be creative. The second thing we talk about reasonableness criterion. Reasonableness criterion, which talks about the teacher, meaning the teacher must have must be flexible, must interact with learners, the teaching method of a teacher. So now we are going to the criterion of manner or rationality. We are talking about the criteria of manner and rationality. This part talks about the attitude of a teacher and a learner within a classroom. Criterion of manner or rationality. First thing, teachers should acknowledge learners in a classroom. As a teacher, you must acknowledge the presence of learners within the class. You need to acknowledge them. You need to take them serious. It mustn't be you don't acknowledge, you don't take them serious. You need to acknowledge the presence of your learners within the classroom. The second thing is a teacher must observe the uniqueness of learners within the classroom. You have to understand that we've got different learners within the classroom. Some learners are slow, some learners are fast, some learners are afraid to, they're shy. They're shy to communicate, they need attention. So, as a teacher, you need to identify the uniqueness of learners. You need to observe that some learners, they are unique. The third thing is the teacher should give a room. Should give a room and understand how learners behave. Should give a room and understand the behaviors of different learners in order to accommodate each and every learner. The teacher should be able to accommodate each and every learner. The fifth thing I can say, the teacher should not discriminate. The teacher should not discriminate learners. Remember, within the classroom, sometimes we've got learners who are disabled. We've got learners who are not disabled. So as a teacher, you can't discriminate them. And sometimes discrimination does not necessarily mean saying offensive statements. Even the kind of a content which you can bring to a class for learners to interact with can discriminate. It means there are certain things which a disabled learner cannot be able to read. They need assistive devices in order for them to be able to be on the same standard with other learners. So a teacher should not discriminate. Also, the teacher should give learners attention. The teacher should give learners attention. Remember, we're still on manner or rationality. The teacher should give learners attention. The teacher should respect learners. The teacher should have respect towards learners. So in conclusion, I just want to emphasize on the matter of teaching criteria. Teaching criteria, these are characteristics or standard of measure we use for teaching. It means we measure teaching based on three things. We measure teaching based on the subject matter. We measure it based on the teacher. We also measure it based on the manner or the rationality. So we've got three things. Intentionality criterion, which is the subject matter. It talks about the subject, what the teacher is teaching. Second thing, we have got the reasonableness criterion, which is the teacher. Then we've got the manner and rationality. So that's it for this tutorial.